Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming to Accelerating Data-Driven Drug Development. My name is Joshua New. I'm a senior policy analyst here at the Center for Data Innovation. For those of you that don't know us, we are a nonprofit, nonpartisan public policy think tank studying the intersection of data, technology, and public policy, which I've learned means we get to work on all the fun buzzwords like precision medicine, AI in drug development, some really fascinating topics, and we're very excited to have you all here today. One, for the release of a report that we just put out titled The Promise of Data-Driven Drug Development. There are copies available in the back and on our website at datainnovation.org, but also for a fantastic panel of experts in the field that are going to share their expertise about how they're using data to advance drug development and provide some feedback on some of the ideas that we put forward in the report. So first, some housekeeping. This event is being live streamed on our website at datainnovation.org, and we're going to be live tweeting using hashtag #DataInnovation. For those of you watching online, there'll be a chance for audience Q&A, and we will try to get to any questions that are asked on Twitter using that hashtag at the end as well. This new report covers a lot of ground, but I want to talk about three main ideas that we kind of address in it. First, I want to highlight the promise of data-driven drug development, the many ways that AI is transforming all aspects of the drug development lifecycle. I want to talk about the one kind of big radical idea that we propose in the report is the creation of a national health research data exchange, which is our proposal to dramatically transform how patient data is shared to advance medical research throughout the entire healthcare ecosystem. And finally, there's a couple other ways that we mentioned in the report that policymakers can advance data-driven drug development. And we're going to touch on those briefly, but for more information, look in the report. We're not going to talk about them too much today. So, to help frame the discussion, I think it's really important to understand just how impactful data-driven innovations, particularly artificial intelligence, have been at every stage of the drug development lifecycle. And so we are defining the drug development lifecycle as a four-stage process: discovery, clinical research, FDA review, and FDA post-market safety monitoring. The FDA technically identifies a fifth stage of preclinical research, but for our purposes, since there's not a lot of substantive differences there, we merged that into clinical research. In terms of discovery, over the last half century, advances in computing and increasing access to data have transformed drug discovery from a science that primarily relied on the analysis of existing remedies and kind of serendipitous discovery to a science that engineers drugs based on large-scale screening, known as high-throughput screening, of molecules known to be involved in a disease process and observing their effects on specific proteins. So pharmacology has always been data-driven, but recent developments, particularly the maturation of AI, have the potential to dramatically refine and improve these techniques that we've been using for the past several decades. Access to greater computational power, more data, and more advanced algorithms has also led to a resurgence in phenotypic screening, which uses the same approach as target-based discovery, but instead observes the effects of a candidate compound in whole cells, tissues, and even entire organisms, rather than just a specific protein. This kind of screening was the norm in pharmacology for many years, but did not really lend itself well to high-throughput screening because of the complexity of the analysis involved. Fortunately, AI is very well suited for this kind of work, particularly computer vision software. And it's enabled the large-scale application of high-throughput screening techniques to phenotypic screening. Despite these advances, drug screening for discovery is a lengthy and expensive process. Fortunately, here too, data technologies are helping, in particular by enabling what's called in silico screening, which uses machine learning to evaluate molecules from reference libraries to weed out unlikely candidates. So the molecules that end up being screened are all curated and maybe have a higher chance of success. So a typical high-throughput screening process has a hit rate of identifying a viable candidate molecule of less than 0.05%, whereas high-throughput screening using compounds pre-screened in silico can have hit rates between 10 and 15%, which is orders of magnitude improvement. Another major barrier to developing new drugs is cost, and clinical research is one of the largest contributing factors to this. The average clinical trial costs about $19 million to operate, and keep in mind that that's the cost for an individual trial. Drugs have to go through phase 1, 2, 3, and 4 trials, and it's not uncommon that the entire clinical research phase will end up costing over $100 million for a drug that may not even be successful. Here too, fortunately, the improved use of data and analytics technologies are helping. In terms of patient recruitment, selecting a site to perform a clinical trial can be a major financial commitment, and this is made especially risky due to the fact that there are no guarantees that patients will actually show up. So some companies like Trials.ai and Vitrana have developed AI systems to help minimize this risk to guide site selection decisions based on historical site performance data and other factors. Another of other companies are using AI to improve patient recruitment directly. So there's a London-based company called Antidote that uses machine learning for better targeting of potential participants. The company claims that this system has enabled it to refer 8,000 patients for a clinical trial involving Alzheimer's in under 2 months, and that referrals from this process were 7 times more likely to follow through with a clinical trial process than referrals from other sources. But even when you can get enough patients to show up for a clinical trial, even when you have enough recruits, to be successful, they actually have to participate in the full trial. And there's many reasons that they can end up dropping out. In particular, if they don't feel engaged and they don't follow instructions properly, that data of them participating in the trial won't be particularly useful. Palo Alto startup Bright Health has developed a smartphone app that uses machine learning to improve and maintain patient engagement in order to reduce this risk. It provides users with notifications and nudges for users to perform certain tasks and attend site visits, and also utilizes a chatbot to help make trial information more accessible to participants. But even then, despite the utmost willing patients, many patients do drop out due to negative side effects of the drug being evaluated. Fortunately, machine learning is helping here as well. Researchers have developed an AI system that can identify the fewest and smallest doses of a chemotherapy regimen that can still shrink brain tumors, thus reducing the toxicity of the treatment, but also minimizing the risk of side effects. So in a simulated clinical trial using the system, the model was able to reduce treatment potency by between 25 and 50% without reducing effectiveness, which is a pretty dramatic reduction, and this minimizes the risks and can more reliably ensure that patients will actually complete a trial, that won't be kind of wasted resources on unreliable data. Finally, new technologies are also making it possible to conduct decentralized and virtual clinical trials, which can make it easier to recruit patients over a wide area and reduce overhead costs. So, for example, in October 2017, life sciences company AOBiome Therapeutics completed a 12-week clinical trial of an acne drug that relied entirely on users using an iPhone app to send in pictures and information about their acne. And this is a successful trial. And considering that site visits can cost between $3,000 and $7,000 per patient, that studies can involve dozens of visits and hundreds of patients, the potential for remote data collection can be a massive boon to reducing the cost of clinical research. Next, the FDA review process consists of evaluating data from clinical research to determine drug safety and efficacy. It's a really important stage, and it can be rely on some really extensive data consisting of reports on all studies and analysis from clinical and preclinical research. Just as the pharmaceutical industry and researchers are leveraging data to accelerate their processes, the FDA too is recognizing the potential of data to improve regulatory processes. So in particular, the FDA has begun to conduct real-time analysis of clinical research data as soon as it becomes available, enabling it to approve or reject a drug much more quickly. So this is being done as part of the FDA's Real-Time Oncology Review, or RTOR pilot program, which focuses on bringing cancer drugs to market and more quickly approving existing drugs for new applications. In September 2018, the RTOR program approved an expanded use of the breast cancer drug Kisqali just 1 month after the drug's submission date. This is a dramatic turnaround reduction, and the FDA's review process for new drugs can take anywhere from 6 months to 2 years. So the FDA's plans to use real-time data are limited to the RTOR pilot right now, but this is a model that could easily be adapted and expanded to the broader drug regulatory approval process. Finally, despite all of the analysis and data provided to the FDA before a drug is cleared for the market, it's impossible to gain a clear understanding of a drug's efficacy and safety until it's already out in the world. That's why in 2007, the FDA launched its Sentinel Initiative to help monitor the safety of drugs after they have reached the market. The initiative analyzes large amounts of data from electronic health records, insurance claims, and partners to create a post-market risk identification system. This eventually transformed into the full-fledged Sentinel system, which was launched in 2016, which now covers millions of patients. The initiative's goal was initially to keep unsafe drugs off the market, but in the FDA's 5-year 2019 to 2023 plan for the Sentinel system, the agency stated that one of its goals was to explore the utility of real-world data as a tool to support drug development and assess medical product performance. So specifically, that means the FDA wants to use the Sentinel system to help the agency define, test, and shape regulatory-grade data, methods, and analytical standards for the drug development process. So this is where we are today, and kind of what's a little bit on the horizon of what we can expect to see more and more of. And all of these benefits were made possible in large part to the increased access to data, but in particular to the increased access to patient data, thanks to electronic health records, information sharing from healthcare partners. But without continued advances in increasing this access to patient data, this progress will stagnate. There's a lot of research that shows that patients are very willing and eager to share their information to advance medical research with both nonprofits and for-profit researchers, but they really have very few opportunities to do so. That's why in the report, kind of the big idea that we're proposing is the National Health Research Data Exchange, which is a data exchange with as close to universal participation across the country as possible, that any qualified researcher or institution could access for research purposes, including for drug development. There is a lot of precedent for this. Health data registries and disease registries are common throughout the healthcare space, and they provide researchers with participants' clinical trial data to advance the understanding of disease and help develop new treatments. These have enabled a large amount of valuable research, but they do have a lot of shortcomings. They require patients to proactively seek them out to participate. They only focus on specific conditions most often, and they may not accumulate large enough data sets to be useful, and they may not collect data in standardized formats, making it difficult to share and combine this data with information from other sources. A National Health Research Data Exchange, which I'll just be calling the Exchange from now on to save us a mouthful, would deliver the benefits of these registries on a massive scale while eliminating many of their shortcomings. Unlike registries that compile participants' health data into a centralized database, the Exchange could instead rely on a decentralized architecture with a standardized application programming interface, or API, to provide access to data within EHR systems where they already live. This could ensure that records are longitudinal and always up to date, rather than just a snapshot of patients' records when they submitted them to any of one-off disease registries. So developing this exchange would be a significant initiative, and we have no illusions about that. But this could deliver massive benefits for drug development, healthcare research, and public health. And as a first step, we're urging Congress to direct NIH, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, ONC, the Centers for Disease Control, the FDA, and other relevant agencies to develop a roadmap for the establishment of the exchange. And we have some ideas of how specifically we can make this work. So to ensure EHR integration, policymakers should direct CMS and ONC to require the integration of an exchange API for an EHR system to be eligible for certification and incentive payments through the Promoting Interoperability Program. This is formerly the Meaningful Use Program that CMS and ONC developed to be able to qualify for reimbursements under Medicare and Medicaid. Establishing the original meaningful use standards involved extensive deliberation with stakeholders, such as hospitals and EHR developers. However, the final stage of meaningful use actually required the integration of API functionality. So this would be a relatively minor addition on top of the performance standards that these providers are already required to meet. In terms of encouraging patients to actually participate in this exchange, we envision this as being an opt-out system for a couple of reasons. So patients are going to be automatically enrolled and they're given the option to decide not to participate. First, we know that patients want to share this information by and large. The vast majority of patients are willing to share their data even for-profit research. Second, opt-out kind of nudges people to share their data. This is a socially beneficial behavior. It's an issue of public health, and encouraging patients to do this as best we can is going to be beneficial to patients overall. But finally, you should have the option to opt out if you care passionately about not sharing your data through this exchange. But an important addition that we think would be valuable here is that even if patients want to opt out of participating in the exchange while they're alive, they should be given the option to donate their data after death. Currently, HIPAA prevents the sharing of patients' data after their death unless they've otherwise provided consent for up to 50 years, which can be really problematic and impedes access to a lot of valuable patient data. But we imagine that there's going to be a large portion of the population that doesn't want their data being shared while they're alive, but is totally fine after their death, and they should be given that option. And access to this to the exchange should be governed by a contractual model to guard against misuse. And there is some precedent going on in government to how to figure out what this model to help figure out what this model would look like. So the NIH is developing its All of Us Precision Medicine Research Program, and they're developing a research protocol right now to ensure broad access to its data in ways that meet researchers' needs while still protecting privacy and security. This model could easily be adapted, we imagine, to researchers wishing to access data through the National Health Research Data Exchange. And furthermore, it's really important to note that all data accessed through the exchange would still be subject to HIPAA protections and other protections around sensitive health information. Any participating organization that manages or uses data in a way that violates HIPAA would of course be subject to the penalties defined under the law, but could also be subject to additional penalties related to access to this data, so such as a temporary or permanent ban from the exchange. That creates a really strong pressure to not misuse this information. Finally, another big challenge to an exchange that we identified is the lack of unique health identifiers. Data integrity is going to be really important for the success of this kind of exchange. And though EHR usage is commonplace, healthcare providers do not have an accurate and efficient method of matching patients' records across different systems. Most EHRs use a technique called statistical matching to identify patient records based on attributes such as name, date of birth, and gender, and this exact set of attributes can vary from system to system. But statistical matching is unreliable and very error-prone. Patients may be misidentified if other patients share the same attributes, or the records may not be found if different systems store different data in different formats, or if certain data is missing. And even when these statistical matching algorithms use identifiers, such as a social security number, which has kind of become the default identifier in the healthcare space, they still generate errors because many individuals do not have these identifiers, have more than one of these identifiers, or don't wish to disclose this information. Because of this, it's only possible to link 90 to 95% of patient records uniquely between different data sets, resulting in duplicated and fragmented records. An exchange built around statistical matching would not only pull in erroneous data, but also risk subjecting patients who did not consent to sharing their data with this platform from being forced to do so. So 2 decades ago, HHS actually identified an urgent and critical need, that's a direct quote, to create a standardized system of unique patient identifiers in healthcare. This would allow healthcare providers to consistently and accurately link EHR records or EHR data across different systems. And the original language of HIPAA actually required the use of unique identifiers, but subsequent legislation actually prevented the agency from doing so. So Congress, we think, should direct HHS to implement a unique patient identifier as originally intended under HIPAA to ensure this kind of data integrity throughout the healthcare system, but particularly for the creation of an exchange. So there are a couple other ways that we identify in the report that we think would be really valuable opportunities to further accelerate data-driven drug development. These include expanding access to institutional data, such as data from successful and unsuccessful clinical trials, which is often underreported or reported late. Expanding access to non-traditional data, so providing clear guidance about how to leverage data from non-traditional sources like Internet of Things devices, fitness trackers, and air quality monitors into the clinical research phase. Modernizing regulatory processes, promoting equity, and developing AI skills throughout the pharmaceutical research workforce to help apply a lot of these technologies that we know would be beneficial. So I only want to talk about promoting equity right now. These are detailed in the report, but in the interest of time, I want to talk about this particular issue. So despite the potential of data-driven drug development, its benefits mean less to people who are not represented in the data used to drive new discoveries and evaluate new treatments. This is a symptom of what we at the center call data poverty, which is the social and economic inequalities that arise when from the lack of collection or use of data about individuals or communities. So data poverty is a particular challenge for data-driven medicine as a whole. Historically, racial and ethnic minorities, as well as women, have been underrepresented in clinical trials, for example. Hispanics represent 16% of the US population, but only 1% of clinical trial participants. When certain groups are underrepresented in this data, the decisions made about the safety and efficacy of treatments for patients may be biased. For example, women are more likely to have an adverse reaction to a drug and may respond differently to medical devices. Some drugs have actually even been taken off the market because of women experiencing side effects that weren't accurately represented in clinical trials due to underparticipation. Similarly, studies have found that various racial and ethnic groups respond differently to different medications. So data poverty is not just limited to clinical trials. The majority of participants in genomics research are of European descent, which limits the utility of genomics-focused precision medicine-style approaches. As Jacqueline Taylor, who's a health equity researcher at New York University, explained, it's hard to tailor treatments for people's unique needs if the people who are suffering from those diseases aren't included in these studies. So policymakers do have a couple ways that they can address these concerns. The FDA has made some progress in providing guidance about promoting diversity in clinical trials, although these efforts could be expanded. There could be more educational materials for researchers and pharmaceutical companies about the importance of eliminating data poverty in their research data sets. Additionally, the NIH's All of Us research program is focusing on developing a diverse million-person cohort who donate their data for medical research. This is a tremendous step in the right direction, and this program should be funded to develop rapidly and then expand beyond that initial million-person target. And I also want to point out that a key benefit of a national health research data exchange would be the much more inclusive data collection from all segments of the population, which would go a long way to help reducing these kind of data disparities in the healthcare space. So that's the rest of the time of me talking at you, and now we're going to be launching into our panel. We have three great panelists with us here today, and there'll be moderator Q&A and then time for audience Q&A at the end. And we're going to be resetting the camera, but if you all want to come up. So with us today, we are very happy to have Dr. Chris Austin, who is the director of the National Center for Advancing Translational Sciences at the National Institutes of Health. Next to him, we have Dr. Bradford Casey, the Associate Director of Research Programs at the Michael J. Fox Foundation. And finally, we have Dr. Suba Madhavan, Director of the Innovation Center for Biomedical Informatics at the Georgetown University Medical Center. So thank you all for being here today. Really excited to hear what you have to say about the space generally, but also any feedback you have in our report. And to start off, to launch right into the discussion, can you describe the role of data in your work and how that role has changed over time, particularly the last 10 years as AI has become kind of more commonplace in the healthcare space? Feel free to go down the line. Yeah.
Sure. Happy to start. Thank you. Hello, folks. Thank you all for coming, and thank you for the invitation to be part of this expert panel. So I'm Suba Madhavan. I'm the Chief Data Officer at the Georgetown University Medical Center. So I work very closely with researchers at Georgetown, but also with our clinical partners to enable data sharing for a variety of purposes, including drug development. So the question that Josh just asked was, how have things changed in the last few years? And I think we're seeing titles like Chief Data Scientists and Chief Data Officers. That is a big change in organizations. One of the ways that my work as an informatician, as a data scientist, as a data researcher has changed is that we actually now have access to data to really use in tools like machine learning and artificial intelligence, right? So a few years ago, that was not the case. So we always had this small n large p problem, right? So we would have smaller number of samples, but multiple columns or features for each of those samples, and that would always be restrictive when we want to apply these big data techniques. I think through the research networks and access to data, access to de-identified data and policies and regulations, we now have more access to data sets for research purposes, which I think is a big change for me and my team. And we now are able to not only use our data sets, but also across a research network to validate ideas, to design novel clinical trials, et cetera. So one quick example I would give is we were part of this large pancreatic cancer clinical study, which we at the Lombardi Cancer Center at Georgetown University, we see pancreatic cancer patients, but it's a fewer number of patients. Thank God, it's a rare type of cancer. We participated in a study which involved 14 different academic medical centers across the country. And demonstrated that we were able to run a study that compares biomarker-driven treatments for pancreatic cancers. So essentially, we ran a cancer gene panel across this entire network and in close collaborations with the Pancreatic Cancer Advocacy Network, which is a patient advocacy group, to really demonstrate the power of biomarker-driven treatment selection in pancreatic cancers. We could not have done this as just a single institution. So I think that's what has changed, really access to data through these networks that enables us to use tools to improve drug development, to improve clinical trials, and also recruitment to clinical trials, and better observational studies using electronic medical record data.
So again, I'm with the Michael J. Fox Foundation for Parkinson's Research. We, as the name might suggest, are very focused on defining, measuring, and treating Parkinson's in patients. We're a research funding organization, which means that our historic model is in funding generation of data sets. We also fund analysis of data sets, and increasingly part of our role is to help align the field around data resources that are available, make sure that those are of the highest quality so that we can interpret them in different ways. I think that in our lifetimes, we've seen a dramatic shift in the way that biomedical research is done. That's both at the biological level, trying to develop new hypotheses, but also at the biomarker level as we move things closer and closer to the clinic. And so we see data as a commodity that's really crucial to get to those next steps. And we're willing to turn over a lot of different stones to try to get insights from the data that's generated. A lot of what we've done has been really focused on making sure that these resources are available to the community as much as we can within the wishes and respect for privacy of patients that are willing to share their data with us. So that includes things like sharing the results of our in-house flagship trials. It's the Parkinson's Progression Markers Initiative, which is a very large-scale longitudinal observational study where we've collected a large number of biosamples from patients, as well as the clinical data that goes along with it, genomic data that goes along with it, transcriptomic data that goes along with it, and also imaging data. And we share that pretty broadly. We share that with partners that are in industry, as well as with basic science researchers, to make sure that we can make the most of the investment that these patients have made when they entrust us with those data sets, because we think that that's in the best interest of patients today, and ultimately in the best interest of people who may become patients in the future.
So, Chris Austin, I'm the director of the newest part of the NIH called the National Center for Advancing Translational Sciences. Our mission is to develop technologies and paradigms that will dramatically increase the efficiency and effectiveness of the translational process. And that process, you may not know it by this term, but you know what it is. That is the very slow, expensive, error-prone process of going from a fundamental discovery to an intervention that is shown to improve human health. That process is, as Josh talked about, is currently problematic, put it that way, and most efforts fail. And our thesis is that the reason it fails is that we don't understand the fundamental scientific principles which underlie this process. It's never been studied as a scientific process before. It's never been a scientific field before. It's interesting to ask why that is, but it is the case. And we believe that, like every other area of science, if we understand the general principles, we will transform this process from a phenomenological trial and error effort into a predictive science, much like has happened with genetics and engineering, but certainly not this yet. Why are we interested in data? Well, there are because we are disease agnostic. That is, we're interested in all diseases, and we're interested in the general principles that apply to all diseases. Because actually, the reasons that drugs fail and other interventions fail to get developed in the first place, and then get to all the patients who need them, are actually pretty much the same, no matter what disease you're working on, whether it's cancer or Parkinson's disease or Alzheimer's disease or psoriasis. It really doesn't matter. One of the issues that NIH has is that it is like most universities and medical schools, it is divided by organ systems or diseases, and yet we've been, partially for that reason, we've been impoverished in making progress in the translational space because of that historical organizational sort of principle. And so the unifying principle here, the integrating principle, is of course data. And if you're trying to understand general principles, that's really the only way to do it. So I would ask, if you think about why is this possible? And I love the title of this session, data-driven drug development. It's a little bit like evidence-based medicine, as opposed to what, you might ask. Drug development has always been data-driven. The problem is the paucity of data we have had and the inability or unwillingness, traditionally, to compare all the different experiments that were done in order to learn what those general principles are. So traditionally, we've just done the same thing over and over again and expect a different result. And of course, we haven't gotten a different result. So actually, if you're aware, the efficiency of our community in developing therapeutics has actually been monotonically decreasing since 1950. You may not be aware of that, but that's per $1 billion. How many new drugs do you get per $1 billion? In 1950, it was far higher than it is now, such that the number of drugs you get per $1 billion has gone down by 50% every 9 years since 1950. Gone down 50%. So, and that's despite all the things that have happened since 1950. So clearly a different, really radically different approach is needed. And one of the disruptive technologies which we're pretty excited about is, of course, this, whatever one wants to call it, machine learning, AI, big data, whatever. So what's happened in the last 30 years in my lifetime? The word big data has come up. There's always been data, but it's been small data. When I was in the lab 35 years ago, of course we generated data, but it was small data, and it was in lab notebooks, and virtually none of it was electronic. So the invention and use of computers, the ability of individual researchers in the lab to generate data has changed dramatically in that period of time. You just look at the Genome Project, a perfect example. The first one took 13 years and hundreds of researchers all over the world, and cost, if you include the mapping, about $3 billion. Now a single graduate student can do a genome in a lab by him or herself in a day. So the orders of magnitude of quantity of data has just increased enormously. And of course, that's true with imaging and patient records and x-rays and all kinds of things. So I think as we talk about this in the next half hour or so, I'll give you some examples of what we're doing in this space to integrate data. I would say the thing that comes back to us over and over and over and over again in trying to do this is the the inadequacy of the data which currently exists. And the reason for that, fundamentally, is the data were not generally developed. They weren't gathered with an eye toward comparing it with a lot of other experiments. So if all you're gathering your data for is your use in the lab that day, and you're never going to use it again, the kind of way that you will do the experiment and the kind of data that you will gather, the metadata, if you want to use that term, is going to be very different than you were if you're doing it intentionally to do what we're talking about now. So the vast majority of historical data is pretty poor and turns out to be very difficult to compute on. And it is possible via the data trawlers or data janitors or whatever you want to call them, to clean up some of that data, but sometimes it's just impossible. So I think one of the challenges for us, and if you look at the IBM Watson story, you know what I'm talking about. It's a lot of smart people, just bad data, and there's nothing. It's the garbage in, garbage out, right? So we might talk about that because I think the vision that Josh enunciated is exactly the right one. But we may not have the data we need to really reach that potential at this point. So I think it's not only a question of how we make the data available, but how we incentivize people to gather data, better data going forward.
That's a really good point and a really nice segue into the next question I wanted to ask about what, we know the promise, there's a lot of hype about what we could be doing, but there are a lot of different barriers from making that happen. We identified a lack of access to patient data, which we'll get into in a bit, but you identified messy or inadequate data. Do you two want to talk to what are some of the data or non-related barriers to doing this kind of work that we know is theoretically possible but maybe not practical in a real environment?
Sure. So I can start, and I'm sure the Suba will have points on that as well. As Chris just mentioned, there are major challenges. We stand on the shore of the sea in terms of these new methodologies, and if we have good enough data, then we can apply the best methodologies and we can make the most of that, right? The key challenge there is making sure that we not only have the best methodologies, but we also are realistic about the source that we're feeding into it in terms of that data, so we can make the most of it. Now, these next generation analytics approaches not only prefer, but really demand very high quality, structured, ideally, data sets that are consistent across the entire data set as much as you can, and are just high quality data for training. And with that, an ideal platform will be able to tell you the truth of what lies within it. But every time you remove a piece of that, every time you have a clinical record that's unavailable and has to be imputed, for example, you're weakening the ability to draw conclusions from it that reflect the reality that you believe is present in that data. And that sounds like kind of a philosophical approach, but really it's a nuts and bolts, real-world problem that we run into constantly, because all of the data that's been historically generated is generally poorly suited for this type of analysis. So you really have to start from scratch in many instances. We've tried to take that approach in our in-house studies, but really that's happening across the field. People are using bigger studies. They're using more regimented data collection processes. They're using much better data harmonization processes. Anyone who has ever looked through, for example, handwritten clinical notes for patient data will tell you that there are 30 different ways to record medication status or medication timing or the different symptomology that patients might see.
As soon as you could read it.
Exactly, yeah. Yeah, and there's natural language processing that will help you get to it. Sure, there's great approaches that will help you categorize and formulate different bins that you can work with. You can polish these data sets in a lot of ways, but it's really making the most of it means having realistic understanding of what you can get out of that data up front and seeking that rather than seeking the headlines that a lot of people tackle, I think.
Yeah, and Chris mentioned large-scale genomic data sets that we're now capable of generating as a system, as a research enterprise. And this is something that I routinely have a conversation with my teenage son, who's actually interested in computer science. And of course, I try to motivate him not to build yet another photo sharing website. And we've got a lot of disease areas that we need smart computer scientists on. And so, if you look at the amount of genomic data that we're collecting as a research enterprise, if you put them on these 1.6 millimeter CD-ROMs, the first question is, what is a CD-ROM, right? That's what the kid asks. But if you stack them up, just as a world, the collective genomic data that we're collecting, not just in the United States, but other international programs, and you stack them up, you can go all the way from the Earth to the Moon and a quarter of a way back, right? That's the amount of genomic data that we're collecting. But how do you make all of that useful, right? So from a single individual, the amount of genomic data we can collect is about 1 terabyte of information, right? So 1 terabyte of data. And my team manages about 100 terabytes of data and analyzes and filters and data janitorial services to pre-process on a daily basis. On a daily basis, we process about 100 terabytes of data. So we're part of this consortium called ClinGen, which is led out of the Genome Institute, the NHGRI, which is part of NIH, which is about 1,000 investigators around the world who are taking these genomic data sets and attaching it to evidence from literature and from clinical studies and entering it in a structured form in databases so that they can be useful, right? A lot of the binary files that come out of genome sequencers are not readily usable. You cannot put that data in front of a busy clinician. So how do you go from that unstructured, computable data sets to simple reports and usable reports for the end users, for the researcher and the clinician? I think is the biggest challenge that we face today. And we talked about EHR data and what's happening in the EHR data, and we talked about the omics data. But the EHR data, some of the challenges are really, creating that structured data sets for good observational studies. I think as a country, we don't have resources to run randomized controlled trials to check and compare every drug that's possible, even in a preclinical setting, or and this was articulated by Chris as the primary mission of NCATS. So how do we make de-identified clinical data sets available for research purposes? And we can talk about a number of challenges there, IRB approvals, and also data governance that needs to occur within organizations. People like to hold the clinical data close to their chests. I think we're moving in the direction where patients will own the data and they will be responsible for assigning access to various stakeholders through systems like blockchain, for example, right? So that's the future we're moving towards. So how do we create an infrastructure that enables that distributed control and makes clinical data accessible so that we can then, as data scientists, interconnect that with the biomarker and the omics data for newer drug development? I think that is the challenge that we face today. Not the data generation, not the storage, we've got that with the cloud computing, but how do we analyze and make that available and accessible to researchers and clinicians and decision makers?
Great. So you two both touched on it briefly, but I want to ask a little bit about what the non-data barriers to the greater use of data are. Dr. Casey, you mentioned people have incentive to chase headlines rather than practice good data stewardship. You mentioned that data ownership might be an issue. What kind of other cultural barriers exist? Are companies not willing to play nice with each other? Are there regulatory obstacles in place that prevent sharing beyond what is necessary? What's been your biggest frustrations that don't actually have to do with the data itself?
Well, I guess the simplest problems for us to solve in this space have been the technical ones. Those we can solve because they do pay attention to certain rational rules most of the time. Humans, however, do not. And so the human cultural problems are by far the biggest ones. And they have to do with credit, they have to do with perceived value, they have to do with incentives, they have to do with ethics sometimes, and a very large amount of good old-fashioned human tribalism that people just, you know this, right? I mean, if you take everybody in this room, you're sort of all together. Psychologists can do experiments. If we say you're on the blue team, you're on the red team, and then we test you about your level of hostility toward those people, it goes up as soon as you tell them that. So it's baked into us as a species. So this idea of sharing has to overcome this very sort of primal idea of this primal sort of thinking that our brains do. So we've had this issue, and Suba knows this well. In the program that she's involved with, this Clinical Translational Science Award program. It's a very large program at the NIH. It's actually the NIH's biggest single program. It's about $550 million a year. So it's about twice the size of the Cancer Center program, if you're familiar with that. And we're lucky to have in that program over 60 Subas. They're not all as good as Suba, but there are 60.
They're better than me.
Data people, and the question that we've had is, okay, gosh, this is all within one program. Is 60 of the biggest, most advanced, distinguished, wealthy, if you will, academic health centers in the country, and they were all, when we took over 8 years ago, they were all operating independently. And we thought, this is just silly, because we looked across the whole network, and there were 130 million people taken care of across all of these places. And we said to ourselves, this is unbelievable. This is just a gold mine. If we could tie all these together. And then the problem came, what platform are we going to use? How are we going to get everybody to agree? I must say, we've come a huge way since then. We're about 2/3 of the way of tying all these together to be able to do things like recruitment, finding patients for clinical trials in ways that were just impossible before. The other problem that we've had more on the fundamental side through a program called Translator we've been doing that we might talk about is the data sets, because they were generated under different conditions, and they weren't generated, even when they were generated by NIH funding, and a lot of them were, they have data use agreements which actually give the developers and the rights to the data, so they don't have to share with anybody. And NIH gave them those rights. So now we're in this ridiculous situation as being an NIH center that's trying to organize all the data that NIH funded to generate, but a lot of that goes back decades before the current thinking of data came into existence, and that has been a huge problem to get people to overcome this. The other thing that we're dealing with has nothing to do with the data is that though storage of data cost has come down a lot, it is a cost, and nobody wants to pay for it. Everybody, at least at NIH, everybody wants to generate new data. But just imagine books were written over the years and there was no library. That's essentially what we're doing. We don't want to pay for the library. So many of the data sets, and OMIM is just the most famous of them, has actually had to put a notice on their website, like Wikipedia has. Please contribute to this database because NIH isn't supporting it anymore, and it's going to shut down unless you send us $50. So there's some and yet you can understand, NIH is under a lot of pressure to do new things. But if our thesis is right, that you can, as is often said, if we had the data, 5 minutes in the library will save you 3 days in the lab, right? Because you discover what's already known. That is just penny wise and pound foolish, and yet those kinds of things are a very real problem at NIH currently. So those are just a smattering. And the human subjects issues, we haven't even gotten into those, but I'll let Suba talk about those.
I mean, just to kind of dovetail on what Chris just said, I joke that all my gray hair is from writing the indemnification clauses, signing the BAA with cloud providers to put clinical translational data on the cloud. And this was 10 years ago when AWS created an education forum to get de-identified clinical data, which is technically not HIPAA, to get the data on the cloud. And and cloud platforms can be expensive, right? And it's sort of this, if only I had a penny every time people said cloud was expensive and not really using all the cloud technologies that are available to them to reduce costs. So, for example, there are these low-cost storage options on AWS called Glacier, right? So you could actually generate the data, if you stored the samples, you could regenerate the data and not store it indefinitely and be incurring that cost. But finish your analysis, get rid of that data, and if you needed that data again, just regenerate the data. You've got your samples in your freezer, right? So it goes back to really training. We're now have all these big data technologies, and I think getting the next generation trained on how best to use them to reduce costs and to make data available and in a structured form. As someone who works at a higher education institution, I mean, this is, as I say, data science is the sexiest job in the market, and we don't have enough data scientists who really understand how to play with this data. So in terms of non-technology related challenges, I think training and also getting the providers, the vendors of big data technologies to really make those indemnification clauses in the BAs easier to make both academic institutions and industry and others to work with them to utilize some of the technologies that they're building to make this all possible.
Yeah, I think the other thing that we've run into, and I know probably Suba and Brad have both run into this, is that the data sharing sounds like it shouldn't cost anything. If I'm going to share my water with Brad, that is a cost-free transaction. But data sharing is not free. It actually requires you to do a lot of work to actually put it in a form that would be useful to somebody else. And even worse, and we're trying not to be practitioners of this at our place, but many times NIH and other organizations will require data sharing, but there will be no platform into which to put the data. So you're saying, Mr. Investigator, you have to share, or Dr. Investigator, you have to share these data, and they say, okay, where do you want me to put it? Fine. And they say, well, we don't have any place to put it, but you still have to share it. So it's that kind of silliness. So what they then do is they take as short a cut as they can, create a quick and dirty way to share it to satisfy the requirements. None of the metadata, so they've met the letter of the law. And then it's useless when data people come along to try to use it. And this is another self-inflicted wound that I think the community just we have to catch up with. We're just not used to doing this. Because traditionally what happens is all data ended up in written journals, written on papyrus. And so that was the data. But that ain't the data anymore. But we're still stuck in the previous era for the most part.
Chris, you and Suba have both made really great introductions to a couple points I'd like to make. One is about the idea of the challenges of sharing, because it is a challenge, absolutely, but it is also a real responsibility.
Yeah.
One of the privileges of my position is I actually get to meet with patients fairly often and talk to them about what matters most to them about our mission. And patients that come in often, very frequently, to provide very invasive biosamples, things like CSF sampling, right?
Yep.
They want to make sure that we are going to make the most of that, and that's our obligation as a research supporter, right?
Yep.
They also want to make sure that that's going to be shared as broadly as possible, and so we start with the initial priority that we need to get this data out there. And you're right, there are major challenges with the platforms that are available. Suba pointed out that people really don't leverage the technology that's been generated to make it easier to run a cloud that handles search engines and handles social media transfers and everything else, handles banking all around the world. All that technology was developed to make that cheap. It wasn't really developed around the idea of making it cheap to go through massive amounts of genomics and imaging data. So one of the things that we've prioritized is development of those kind of platforms. One that you may have heard about, the Accelerating Medicines Partnership, which is a public-private partnership with the NIH and industry partners, actually provides storage as well as an obligation for people to provide their study data into that platform, and then to try to reduce the costs and avoid the idea that we're both going to work on the data, we're both going to incur our own costs. We also provide an analytics platform built into that, so it's based on open source principles, again, to try to drive that cost down. And while I'm not going to say that we're the only model, I think that things like that are becoming increasingly important for making the most of these data sets as we generate more and more, and as we have more and more complicated things that we need to do.
Great. So I want to shift gears a little bit because we got still a lot of stuff I want to talk about. So the National Health Research Data Exchange that we propose in the report, how would that, if that were to exist in a perfect world where everything was designed as you would like it and all the data standards were as you would like it and it's easy to access the kind of information, how would your job change if this were a resource that you could rely on? What would that look like?
I mean, I was just at the Odyssey symposium yesterday, and the Odyssey, I can't remember the acronym. It actually I think it stands for Observational Data Science and Health Informatics. So the whole purpose is to share clinical data. So if you have a rare disease trial that you want to run, you have a whole network in which you can actually run the trial. So the beauty of such networks, and Odyssey is not the only one. I mean, there are many others. There is CD2H that Chris might talk about. So what these networks are enabling is not to centralize data, right? So which is actually one of the barriers. If you say that I'm going to create, we actually attempted this 10 years ago, Georgetown Database of Cancer. We're going to centralize all the cancer data. You don't get very far, right? Because people have their own policies of how they want to store data within their own organizations behind their firewalls. And so networks like these are beginning to do distributed query models, right? So I have a query that I want to run, pancreatic adenocarcinomas, patients with BAP1 mutation. I'm interested in running a biomarker-driven drug development trial. Are there other patients with those mutations? I might have 2 at my site, but maybe through a network, I might have a large number of such patients who might have that particular genetic marker. So I think we're moving more and more in the direction of distributed querying of large networks. And I think, there have been other efforts, right? So this is, we've been talking about this over the last couple decades, at least, the HIEs, for example, the health information exchanges. Even though the purpose was slightly different to support operational quality, et cetera, I think they could be the backbone for clinical translational research as well, these types of networks. How would that change my life? I think our team is constantly looking for more data. I mean, not a week goes by when we're not participating in some data challenge or dream challenge or another to get access to more data sets. I actually have a couple people who have named data sharks within our team. Their job it is to go seek out data sets, either free and open publicly available or commercially available, such as CMS data sets that are massaged and made available for research purposes. So if such a network was available and accessible, I think it would reduce a lot of startup time for projects, because I would already know what data sets are available and whether or not my study is going to be feasible.
Yeah, let me just add a couple things there. Just a couple of points that's important for people to know in case you don't know this. You might wonder, in addition to the doctor's notes problem, why this is such an issue. Computing on clinical data is such an issue. The EHRs were not created for research; they were created for billing, and so so what doctors do is they have to find a billing code which is close enough to what the patient had, but also maximizes their revenue. Right. So what the patient actually has may not be what the billing code was, and you also, depending on what billing code you use, and depending on what insurance the patient has, the patient may have more or less of a copay, and all of that goes into what the EMR says. So either there are sloppy reasons and perfectly good reasons why the data in these are not ideal for research, put it that way. The second is that I run into people all the time who just think all you got to do is have more data. And this is what a friend of mine at our place likes to call the idea of data composting. The idea that if you just take enough data and you pile it together, like composting, something magic will happen, and you wait long enough and this beautiful topsoil will come out the bottom. It doesn't happen. All you get is a garbage heap. But there is this idea that all you got to do is make it public and make it available. And this was something called the Data Commons effort, if I remember, started out in that direction, and it's basically crashed, much like some earlier efforts did. It was smart people, good idea, but Okay, so there have been, as Suba mentioned, sort of proto efforts like this, things like the Blue Button or Sync for Science is another one. But what this would do is institutionalize that ability, and secondly, it would create a culture. I think it would create an expectation of sharing, which currently. It's starting to change, but with the exception of the patient-driven funding, which is very clearly, that's one of the reasons we think patient involvement is such a disruptive and positive force as well, along with data. There still is an expectation, the traditional expectation that, as doctors like to say, and I hope they stop saying it, but traditionally, doctors would refer to my patients, my data, my this, my that, and there was no expectation that this was the data on which they built their career. They got tenure. They've spent years developing this. You ain't taking my data out of my cold dead fingers. You're getting that data, and that's a cultural change that I think this would really accelerate.
Yeah, I'll just briefly say I think you're right on the money, and I think that the challenge of everyone's data vineyard, right, where you have this field that's been providing you a crop of data throughout your career is changing. I think that people are changing their expectations around it, and I think that something like this registry is very powerful because not only does it help entrench a culture of sharing at the beginning, it also makes sure that you know that, if you have your patient, I have my patient, but Suba wants the data. If all the data is going to be online anyway, we better go ahead and get on board with sharing up front. And I think that can be really transformative. So I think that the idea that there's that expectation and also access to the data up front, right, so that when Suba then wants to get genomic data or something, there is no reason for her to sequence it again. Right? Yeah. The costs are so high. The storage is high. Why would we do that twice? So I think it also really helps make sure that we have efficient use of that data.
I think maybe I'll just quickly add that I think we ought to collectively think carefully about incentive models, right? Yes. And I think Chris mentioned this. Exactly. Sharing the water bottle is free. I think unless there are incentives, and incentives don't have to always be funding or resources. There could be other incentives. We think at our institutions, we think very carefully about tenure and promotion, for example. Yes. And we incorporated a whole category for team science. Mm-hmm. And so you could actually get credit for, building a database, sharing a data, being part of a research network, et cetera, which actually could get you from the assistant professor to associate professor, not just your publications or patents. Right. So I think collectively thinking about incentivizing, and we all understand that it's a good idea, but, without incentives, they don't happen. Right. And how do we think about those incentives? I think over the next years, that's a major challenge to overcome to make these research networks come alive, so to say.
Yeah. Do you want to talk about FIRE?
Sure. If Josh wants to talk about it.
Yeah, well, we have time for about probably 2 more questions before we turn it over to the audience.
You also know what FIRE is. FIRE actually stands for FHIR, stands for Fast Healthcare Interoperability Resource. Sounds good, right? And it was developed by the HL7 people, but this was a tool which has great promise for bringing order out of chaos, at least in terms of the human data, the clinical data. And NIH took a big step forward, led by the NLM, about a month ago, where we are starting to direct people to use this data exchange format. So that there aren't, umpteen data models, and it all becomes comparable, interoperable, and that's never happened before. Right now, it's a please do this. We think this is a great idea, but I don't think it will be long before NIH says, look, it's got to be in this form. Mm-hmm. But again, it ain't without cost, right? So we have to. That's something we all have to think about.
Sure. So changing gears a little bit here, I mentioned briefly at the end of my presentation, and it's in our report as well, about the importance of recognizing that data-driven medicine, drug development, has to be inclusive, has to be representative if you want these treatments to be broadly enjoyed. So could you talk a little bit about, in your work, how you're taking steps to kind of promote this equity in the data that you're using and the research that you're producing?
Maybe I can quickly start, and Chris knows about so I'll mention our CTSA, which was mentioned earlier. So this is the Georgetown Howard University CTSA, and we also have the VA Medical Center that's part of our consortium. The beauty about this consortium, and I'm sure this is similar across all of the CTSAs as well, one of our primary goals is to create a diverse living laboratory for clinical data, clinical translational research in the greater Washington, D.C. area. So if you look at Georgetown University Hospital, it's mostly affluent population that gets treated at the Georgetown University Hospital. 4 miles down the road, it's either Washington Hospital Center, which is part of the same MedStar Health Network, or Howard University Hospital, which is 4 miles down the road. And when a new clinical trial is envisioned and a protocol is written, we actually have a Georgetown Howard University's IRB, a centralized IRB, that ensures that there are participants all across and not just from Georgetown. But the study is then propagated across the investigator network throughout GUCS. We call it GUCS Consortium, the Georgetown Howard University CTSA. And that's one of the steps we're taking to make sure that there is diversity and there's inclusion across the network. Why set up the CTSA network if you're not taking advantage of it to increase diversity in our clinical studies? So if there was one thing that our CTSA has solved, or maybe two things, of course it has taken our data science efforts to the next level, but even higher than that in terms of priority for us within GUCS is increasing diversity in our clinical studies, and that's what the GUCS consortium has enabled.
Yeah, and I was just there are 3 points I would make. One is that exactly what Suba described in a local or regional level, we're doing on a national level. So you could and imagine the potential of that. The second is we've funded specific grants and specific centers focused on specifically on this problem, on recruiting more diverse populations, and this happens to be out of Vanderbilt Meharry down in Nashville. But that center works with all of the CTSAs. The third is this problem, I think, which Josh was getting at, which is, okay, well, that's great going forward, but what about all the data that are out there now, which really are historical data, especially the genetic data? It's mainly comes out of European populations. And so what do we do about that? We actually are so concerned about this in our own AI efforts, because with AI and machine learning, you got to use the data you currently have. You know, granted, fixing it going forward, we think we're doing the right things to do that. But so the first thing is to be aware that your data, and this is what we've said, your data are biased until proven otherwise. And so if you start people with that idea, and the onus is on them to show that it is representative, then that turns the whole thing on its head, and I think it has been very positive for us. The other is we're really worried about how we do this over the long term. By this, I mean as we get more into machine learning and AI, and NIH is doing this on a broad level too. How do we address this problem? So we just had a workshop last month on this and brought a whole bunch of people in who do this kind of clinical work for a living to say, what, A, how do you handle this now? And B, what is the research agenda that we need to fund to address the problem? So I think the awareness is there now. I think if you have to turn it on its head and require researchers to show that their data are representative, and then have a research program to be able to make that dream that we all have come true. I think that's what we have to do.
Yeah, I mean, your points are obviously right on the mark, but I just want to expand on something that you mentioned and kind of on the theme that we discussed earlier. So if we believe that all of the data sets have an inherent bias, which I think we can all agree on that, and we agree that the very best methodologies that are available to us today will accurately reflect that data and give us a sense of the trends that are going on within that data, I think that the real next generation is to add also a capability to tell us the limitations of the data up front, so that people are realistic about it, so that people can go into it and understand, all right, this tells us a great deal about how, for example, a treatment works in aging white
Yeah,
males,
which
but it
is
doesn't
great.
tell us a great deal about how it might work in minority populations at younger ages or something like that. And once we know those blind spots, we can really start to help build out the data set to be more diverse and more accurately reflected, and build out the methodology toolboxes to make sure that we can do downstream analysis and really understand it. Because I think that even if you talk to pharmaceutical companies who are really in the business of making these treatments, they'll say, sure, it would be a little tricky for us if it only worked on one subpopulation, but that's also an opportunity for them to look at different populations, and it's an opportunity for all of us as scientists to really understand more about the mechanisms. Because if there's a drug that is a real knockout in one population and not so great in another, there's understanding to be had there.
Yeah, and this point, the point that Brad made, is really, really important. And most people don't make it, so I just want to underline what he just said. Science advances on the basis of difference, right? I mean, if you do an experiment, it's A versus B, something happens or it doesn't happen. That difference is what allows you to discover things. And so this whole idea that this is an onerous problem which is going to get in the way of science is just factual, it's just historically incorrect. That we will discover things from those differences, but right now is we don't look. So there are all kinds of things which are just waiting to be discovered that because we're looking at a subset of the population, we're not able to identify. And so this is an enormous opportunity. It's not just a burden, it's an enormous opportunity, and I think people have to begin to look on it that way.
Yeah, I think there is a clear agreement that increasing diversity is going to have better trials for us, and I think we're all, as the clinical enterprise, either academic medical centers or other sponsors who are running these trials, are making the right efforts. But I think looking at it from the other side of the coin, some of the underserved population also have difficulty with compliance, right? So there's this, single mother with 4 children. She's on a clinical trial. Is she going to make that doctor's appointment to either, get that treatment or, be compliant with the protocol? So what are some efforts on the community side that need to happen to kind of meet in the middle? Yes, there are efforts to increase diversity, but how do we sort of support the community, right? Because a lot of clinical care doesn't happen in health systems, and we know this. They happen in churches, they happen at schools, for example. So I think having those connections and sort of supporting the community is going to be important if we really want to improve diversity in our clinical trials.
Yeah.
Great. Well, we've got about 15 minutes left, so I want to take the chance to open up to audience Q&A. I have plenty more that I want to ask you about, so we will be talking until 2:30. But I want to give folks a chance to ask some questions. So please raise your hand. We'll come around with the microphone, and please say your name and where you work, and then we'll also open up the chance for any questions from Twitter if we have any.
Good afternoon. Jenny LeRae with Research America. This is so interesting, and we've been doing a lot of work on real-world data, real-world evidence, particularly around where the FDA is after 21st century cures and the last round of user fee agreements. And as you know, they're looking at how to use real-world data for new indications of existing drugs, as well as safety profiling, and possibly new drugs for rare populations.
Mm-hmm.
My question is about the best source of that patient data, because we know the EMR is greatly flawed. Claims data is often being used. If you were to give a policy prescription, should we be trying to improve EHRs as a source of patient data for outcomes? As Dr. Austin noted, it was not meant to work on drug development. It was really more on the delivery side. So should we try to improve the EHR system, which is now 10 years old? Where should we focus from a federal perspective in terms of those systems for patient data?
You do this every day. What do you think?
I mean, it's all of the above. I don't think we're ready to give up on the EHR data yet. I completely agree that it was built for billing purposes and for the care at the moment for that patient. But I think we're, really making great progress in secondary use of data in electronic medical records. I mean, we've got to continue the lobby. We've got to structure the unstructured data. There's obviously going to be clinician notes. We're never going to be able to get away from clinician notes and structure everything. But now with natural language processing and natural language learning is sort of the new way of thinking about natural language processing is could we learn from charts that, in one disease area and so on. You mentioned a very important concept that we didn't discuss, which is repurposing, drug repurposing, right? So thalidomide originally approved for leprosy and then got approved for multiple myeloma, for example. And that was through, the initiative of investigators who linked data from research data sets to electronic medical record data to prior clinical studies and, qualitative and quantitative research. So, and they ended up saving not having to do phase 1 clinical trials because you save a lot of money because the safety profiles are already done for these. So I think what we're here about, which is really connecting data from these different domains, clinical care data, fully de-identified, structured, having the right security and privacy infrastructure, but at the same time connecting them to research data, which can be very high quality, either preclinical, cell line, or animal model data, to look at some of these repurposing ideas. I think we mentioned this before. As a country, we don't have enough resources to run randomized controlled trials all the time. So we've got to be innovative about thinking of ways. So thank you for your question. I think drug repurposing is a big use case for the research data exchange that we're envisioning here.
Yeah, and I think thanks for the question because it's a really important one. And we think about it a lot. And if you think about the two sort of polar extremes, we just say the current system is just never going to work. So just let's start something new and build it. Is attractive though that is in so many ways, it's probably not the best way to go for all kinds of reasons. But I think what we do have to do is, and how we're approaching this, is and my colleagues here sort of mentioned this already, is to provide incentives for people who use these systems and build these systems to put those functionalities in. Secondly, to have this be an experimental platform. That is to say, okay, we're going to ask question of the EMR data, and we're going to get a result, and we're going to assume, like most experiments, it's not going to work, because I don't know about you all, but none of my experiments worked, at least the first time. And so, but that's what you expect, right? So then you go back and you further alter the data platforms and all that stuff, and that's the expectation. So we can't have this expectation that we're going to do this big fix. We're going to do a CA big. Sorry for the bad word. A CA big for EMRs to make them useful for research, but rather have it be a reiterative process. And I can't let the repurposing thing go by without asking you to take a look at what we're doing. There's something called the Biomedical Data Translator. It's probably one of the most exciting programs that we have on. And the idea is to solve this problem once and for all. Go back and watch The Matrix, and then you'll have an idea of what we're trying to do. The concept here is that there are about 20 different languages that the biomedical research world uses, everything from the geneticist to the cell biologist to the pathway people to the pathologist to the pharmacologist to the drug development people to the physicians, and they all have these idiosyncratic languages, and it's impossible to go directly from one to the other. So many translational projects just fall into the crevasses and never get out. And even when you can make a connection, it's an idiosyncratic one-to-one connection, whereas we know there are many-to-many connections between each of those characteristics. So the question is, how would you connect this in one giant matrix? It's an incredibly cool project, which we can actually do now. So we've been going on for about 3 years. Have just finished the feasibility stage. That this is actually possible. It's a 20-dimensional problem, 20 dimensions. Which really gets the data people blood flowing. I can't even conceptualize what that means, but they get all excited when you say that, and it has shown remarkable ability to give insights and to say, for instance, and this is how we just got started on this. Okay, so you got a drug. What diseases are you going to use it in? And there's an almost infinite number. So there's 7,000 diseases. What are you going to start with? Do a clinical trial on all 7,000? I don't think so. But wouldn't it be nice to have a way that you can ask rationally, comparing all the different ways that you can think about how a drug would work, which ones ought you to test? And so those are some of the things that we're starting. And you will be glad to know that from the very beginning we built this as an open source platform. The whole thing's going to be on GitHub, because the worst possible outcome, right, would be for us to create this thing and then have people have to get subscriptions to pieces of it. And if you ask why we did this or how we did this, it's a massive team effort. It's about 100 people from about 20 different universities and research institutions all over the country. We're doing it via something called Other Transactions, part of the Cures Acceleration Network, part of what we do. And it is so exciting to the data scientists and the physicians and the geneticists and others working on this that now fully half the people on this project we don't even pay. They're so excited they work on it for free. And these are academic researchers who I'm not familiar with that behavior most of the time, and yet it is happening here. And I think what it speaks to is what we're all talking about here today. Is the beef there? If you can get data and you can get the right people and you can organize it the right way, can you really make the kinds of logarithmic jumps that we hope? And this project at least would suggest that answer is yes, so the effort is worth it.
Great. I got time for a couple more questions. Do we have any questions from Twitter, just so I know? Okay.
Hi, I'm Caitlin Ringrose. I'm from the Future Privacy Forum. I'm on our health policy team there. My question is for Joshua. You mentioned that with the exchange, data donors would have a mechanism for opting out. Are you conceptualizing that opt-out mechanism as being at the time of collection, or is that later on? And if so, if it is later on, what happens if that opt-out mechanism is exercised when data is already being used for research purposes?
So I want to preface this by saying that this is just like getting the ball rolling on something. This is going to be an initiative that, should it take off, will require a massive amount of deliberation to figure out these kind of details. What we are envisioning is that, tomorrow the system is being implemented. The next time you go to your healthcare provider, you get presented with an agreement saying, I am consenting to participate in this exchange. I can opt out if I choose to. How it would work later on in the fact, say you want to opt out 10 years down the line, that's a really interesting question. I'm not quite sure specifically how that could work. We obviously want to provide strong incentives for people to participate as much as possible. I didn't mention it in my presentation, but in the report we detail potential ways to encourage people to be sharing their data, such as potentially reduced Medicare taxes or prioritization for clinical trial participation, anything that we do to make people realize this is a very socially beneficial behavior. We want to reduce opt-out as much as possible, but still leave that option. So would love to continue this conversation to figure out how some of these specific details would work, but that's all we've figured out so far.
Hi, I'm Dennis Melamed. I'm with the Drexel College of Medicine Clinical Research Management Program. I want to make sure I understood this. The one question that really came to my mind, of the many actually, was when we start doing this, when we start looking to develop research questions with interoperability, with sharing in mind, it seems to me, do we have any tools to help IRBs assess a research protocol that would do that? And when you start phrasing research questions with an eye toward sharing, what effect does that have on the nature of the problem you want to investigate? And you were talking, and this kind of flows in from what you're doing about looking at previous drugs. But I'm thinking, going forward, is there a bias that we might see in trying to say, well, now we will share it with everybody? Does that mean research creep? Does that narrow research questions or expand them when we start looking for future research?
Sure. So we got a couple minutes left, so if I could ask to keep your answers brief so we could get one more question, that'd be great. Thanks.
Sure, Chris.
My
You're all too polite. You need
my thinking about this is that I don't think it would change the nature of the question. I think what it would do is require more rigor and more completeness with the associated data So it's more how you would collect it than what you collect, and it's just that it's like anything where if all you're going to do is use it once, you can be a little fast and loose with it, but if you're going to use it over and over and over again, it's like you're going to build a house. If you're going to live in it one night, you're not too careful. You're going to build it for the next 50 years. You're going to build it in a very different way. You're going to build the same house, but it's going to be, and that's what I'm thinking.
Nothing to add to Chris's response. It's perfect.
Hi, my name is Bain Dubayan. I'm a AAAS fellow at NIH. You mentioned you were talking about data equity and data poverty earlier, and I'm just curious from the panelists what, from your specific organizations, you are doing to incentivize members of populations that have been historically abused, by the medical community, and how you've involved members of those communities that are data scientists in your efforts.
There's no way I can answer that question in less than half an hour. So do you want to? It's a really important question, but just so.
I agree. It's an very, very important question, and I think networks are beginning to respond to that need, right? So, for example, the NCATS initiative, the Trial Innovation Network, where one center, one of the CTSA centers, envisions a study, and it's distributed across the 60 sites, and and they clearly specify in the protocol that these are the needs of the diverse population that need to be included, and that's actually written out in the protocol. And we all go searching in our databases with the process called cohort discovery, and through the cohort discovery process, we put up, okay, we've got 10 patients that actually meet this protocol. So I think those kinds of trial innovation networks are beginning to address some of this. Like we talked before, supporting communities and getting people to come forward for clinical trials. We also find that, and maybe this doesn't happen so much in cancer, because I think the trial participation is fairly high, especially for advanced metastatic cancers. But for other diseases, we feel that people, speaking from wearing my medical center hat, do I really want to be the guinea pig, right? And so really training and explaining what the pros and cons are, et cetera. And we typically find that patient navigators are helpful. So there are people, so it's not just the technology that somebody is just entering their data on a case report form, but actually there's a person that they can talk to who'll talk to them about consenting for the research, et cetera. So we found that having patient navigators who can, speak the language and be one-on-one, actually literally speak the language, right? So numerous times we find people who actually are not very conversant in English, and so explaining to them what this clinical trial is, and that has helped somewhat. So I think those are some things that we're beginning to initiate at our center to improve.
The only other thing I would say is that, and you probably know this already because you're at NIH already, but every one of the CTSAs, for just this reason, is required to have a community engagement component. And one of the reasons for that is that you can't simply go to a community that historically has not, for one reason or another, taken part, and when you need them. You can't do just-in-time patient recruitment, right? You have to have trust with that community from the very beginning, and so that takes a long time. And so that's, I think, the recruitment issue. We approaching it from an informatics perspective, and that's important. How to connect the patients with the physicians and other investigators the other way around. But the other is a cultural inclusion one, and that's not an informatics problem. That's not an informatics solution, really. It's a deeply human one, but it's something that we think without doing both, we're not going to solve this problem. So that's what we're doing.
Great. So we're out of time, so please join me in thanking our panelists.